kind of liking the new things that we're introducing here. We've introduced the watch. We've introduced the string interpolation, even though he talked a little bit later about it. But I think this was a good time to talk about it.
Yeah, so then he also goes into storing numbers too. So the use of whole numbers, real numbers, and float point numbers, which I didn't really know until I read this chapter.
Yeah.
But just writing numbers is also different in syntax too. You can't write phone numbers the way that we normally read them. You'd have to write them.
You have to write them as strings.
Strings, yeah.
Yeah, you have to put them inside the double quotes and treat it as a string. You can't use it as a numeric value.
Let's go into comparing decimal types.
Oh.
That's kind of different how a computer reads it too.
Yep.
So we would have to go to, so for decimals, they were saying, so it's seeing it as like two real numbers kind of thing.
Okay.
So, yeah, so it has to be stored as a number without a decimal kind of thing. So writing it would be, so a number like 10.03 would have to be 1003 or like 1003. You'd have to like write it as that kind of thing.
Okay.
And then.
You mean that's the way the computer stores it?
Yeah, that's the way the computer stores it.
Okay.
And the way to make it show up. They were just saying that it's a good practice to use the I guess the letters for decimals too.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the way that a computer, and I'm actually looking at the book right now to see how he explains it. And I'm going to be honest, I won't pretend to know much about the way the binary table works in order to store anything other than whole numbers or integer values. Once they get into decimals and floating points, it just becomes one of those things where like, hey, I'm going to let the computer handle it. Somebody already wrote all that logic. But it is interesting to understand how it actually stores it in. And quite honestly, I've never taken the time. He does provide a link here. Let's see if we can open it. Let me share my screen and then we could look at it really quick. And where is my Chrome?
Oh, let me stop my share.
Oh, you're good. Okay, so here we go. So they have this 327.849, and the way that they actually store it, I think it's going to go and explain it here. Here we go. With the familiar base 10 out of the way, let's look at the binary numbers. The rule of the games are exactly the same. It's just that the base is 2 and not 10. Digits to the left of the binary point represent increasing powers of 2, while the digits to the right of the binary point represent decreasing numbers of 2. So when you're storing, so the left side, let me get my annotation here. Annotate. the left side of the floating point obviously is going from 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 8, so on and so forth. Where on the, let me clear. Where on the right side of the floating point, it goes the other way. So we have 1, 2, 4, 8. So it's actually decreasing the other direction. And so that's what he's talking about here, is that there's a point value that is being stored as binary values. I wish I had a good example. This is probably something I am going to look into for our next podcast, and we can go into it a little bit deeper.
Okay.
Yeah, this is, it's an interesting topic, and there are some interview questions. Like if you're going to go interview for Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, they're going to ask you some of their questions or some of their quizzes. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Some of their quizzes are going to ask you, write arithmetic functions without using a plus or minus sign. And so now what you got to do is you got to use the binary symbols, or you got to use the binary system in order to do that. And so somebody took the time to program the plus sign to do the arithmetic using binary. And somebody programmed the minus sign to do, the addition and subtraction, depending on the symbol, on the sign that you have on the number, in order to come up with those numbers based on the binary system. So you would basically have to recreate that. So understanding this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think, it's like you're recreating something that somebody already did. But there are interview questions, especially when you're looking for jobs with like very prestigious companies that are all about technology. They're going to say like, hey, yeah, how do you add two numbers without using plus or minus sign in your program? So now you're like, oh, yeah, I have to write my own binary calculator, in order to come up with the sum of the numbers. And so that's where knowing this would help you get your foot in the door. But once you're in there, you got the plus and the minus sign that you're going to end up using anyways. So, so go ahead, share your screen. We'll cover a little bit more about this in the next podcast.
All right. So yeah, we can do the same thing with storing Booleans too, which is just the true false statements. So should we do an example of that too?
Sure. Let's add another line number 9. var b equals true. Actually, it's just going to be true.
Oh, just true.
Not with the double quotes. And then do the console right line. Just B.
B.
Yeah.
Okay.
And your semicolon.
Oh.
So it comes up with the word true, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what if we were to cast it to an int? Can we do that?
I don't know. That sounds
interesting. I don't know either. I'm trying. Oh, it didn't. It didn't like it. Okay. You can't do that. How about if you cast it to a byte?
Byte?
B-Y-T-E. Nope, they don't like that either. Okay, then it's an actual type and the only thing that you can get. But the underlying mechanism is 1 bit. Instead of the 4 bits that make up a byte, you get 1 bit. And that 1 bit is either on or off. And so when you set it to true, it turns on the bit. When you set it to false, it turns off the bit. It's essentially what it comes down to. They just made it a little bit more friendly and said, let's just go ahead and put the keyword true and false in there.
All right. And I think I'm going to teach you something next.
What?
Yeah.
Oh,
With workspaces.
This is where the teacher has, or this is where the student has become the teacher.
So in Visual Studio Code, you usually have multiple files open once you're creating something, or
Yep.
like once you're working on something.
Yep.
So it's important to have those things all working together, kind of thing.
Okay.
So you're seeing all the problems that it has together instead of just separately in the different folders.
Okay.
So I think for this one, we have to create a new folder.
So you want to stop the application because you're watching the files.
Okay. So
Control C.
Control C. Oh, cool.
Yeah. So it's a way of breaking the command line and going back to the prompt.
So I'm gonna make another file called, what should I call it? Second folder.
Sure. Oh, you don't want to use spaces, and you probably want to do all lowercase. And if you want to represent a space, you could represent it with all lowercase.
Oh, lowercase.
Yeah. The reason is because Windows is not case sensitive, where Linux and Mac are case sensitive. So uppercase second file is considered a different folder from lowercase second folder.
Okay.
So that would be 2 different folders that you would have.
And I'm just gonna go to that folder too.
Okay.
Did it make it?
Oh, you made it inside of first app, so you want to create it. So just create a folder in here called second app.
Okay. Second app.
Make their second app.
That's why it's always important to make sure you're in the correct folder too.
That's right.
All right, so now we'll go to that folder. That's why that wasn't working. I was like, all right, and then we're gonna make a new console. Am I doing that right?
I think you need .NET new console.
Okay. And then we're gonna open that over here. And we're gonna go to the programs. Do I just go to it? Oh, there it is. All right, it's a little different. Here we are. So for making or saving your workspace, we are going to, this is the other one, right?
Yeah, you can hit the X and close it.
Okay. We're gonna save this one in the same folder that we have the other one. Let me make sure that it's where I saved that, because I forgot where I saved the last project that we did.
Okay.
Should be under Documents, Sandbox, right? Oh yeah, so they're in the same folder or the same sandbox folder. So we want to save the workspaces together. Is what we're trying to do.
Okay.
So we're going to save the sandbox folder, or we're going to save it to the sandbox folder. That's what we're trying to do.
Okay.
So the second app and first app are going to be saved to the sandbox folder as a workspace.
Okay.
So I'm going to do this one first, just the second app. Save as, or save workspace as, and we're going to put it inside this one, is what they were kind of explaining how to do it.
Oh, so you give it a name up on top, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that saves it. And we're just going to allow it to do its thing. And make sure that the OmniSharp log is on too. Yeah. And then we want to go back and also save the first app to the sandbox folder. To do that, we are going to navigate through to the first one. They also mentioned something about the...
So you want to add the folder to the workspace?
Yeah. This one, we're going to open this one and save it to the workspace as well. So that way they're both in the same workspace.
You want to select that workspace?
Oh, the workspace.
Hang on. You're going to override it.
Oh. I think we just save it to the same folder and it would go to the same workspace.
Okay. Go ahead and replace it.
Okay.
I think I know what you're trying to do. I've never worked with it, but I think I saw something. Go ahead and replace it. And so you're in your workspace, right? And so go to File. And then you see where it says Add Folder to Workspace.
Oh, okay.
Select that.
Oh, that would make it easier, huh?
Yeah, and then you want to add the second app.
Oh, the second app?
Yeah, because you already have the first app in there.
Add it.
And then expand the workspace.
First app.
Second app.
Second app. There they are.
Yeah.
I think we got the sandbox in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Okay. All right. I see what that does. This is the first time I've seen it. I never understood what it does. But yeah, I can see where this is very useful. It's almost like the projects in Visual Studio. So the way, I mean, the solution in Visual Studio, you can include several projects within a solution. And so the workspace would work similarly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I see that. I can see that. Very cool. What else do we got?
Then we could go into storing any type of object.
Any type of object. Oh, dynamics. Yeah. Let's do that really quick. Let's go ahead and in your, let's go ahead and open up the terminal.
Oh, the terminal?
Yeah. And you're under, go to the, oh, this is first app. This is, yeah, this is fine. So let's go ahead and start a new line after line 8.
Okay.
And let's go ahead and do dynamic. Now, the reason you can't do a var is because a var, it infers to whatever type is being assigned to the variable. So when you do var b equals true, really what you're doing is you're specifying that B is a Boolean. So let's change the var and line 10 to be Boolean, bool, B-O-O-L. So having the var B equals true is basically is syntactical sugar that translates to what's on line 10 now. The same thing with line 12. If you were to change that car or that var to car, C-H-A-R, the assignment of the single quote infers to a character. So that's the var again, is syntactical sugar that will translate it. And then on line 14, if you replace the var with string, and also on line 15, var with string, that's essentially what the var is doing, okay? So C# is a what they call an early binding language. In other words, if you know what you need to store in a variable, it will allocate that space in memory. So it knows that a Boolean is 1 bit. And so I just need to allocate 1 bit to store this variable. And it can allocate that 1 bit and access it. And the same thing with the car. It says, I need to store 1 character. So it'll go and allocate just enough memory space to allocate that 1 variable. And
technically, we don't have to have the S, the C, or the B anymore if we write it like that, right? Or do we still have it?
No, you still need to have it.
Okay.
Yeah, you still need to have it because you're assigning it to a variable. In order to refer to it, you need to refer to the variable versus the value, right? And it's going to make a lot more sense once we start writing programs and applications that actually do some real world stuff. It's going to make sense why we need to have variables. Right now, it's kind of like, oh man, it's like, this is kind of like the dredging part of learning how to program. It's almost like learning a new language. It can be boring. And I think this podcast hopefully makes it a little bit more interactive, a little bit more entertaining, and kind of fills in the gap for someone that wants to learn a high level language that can do a lot. But so being able to know is like, I need to store a Boolean, I need to store an integer, I need to store a character or a string. The computer can allocate that memory really quick ahead of time. You know, as it starts loading this information, it'll allocate that memory ahead of time. So that's where it gets its performance, because it can go and allocate all the different space in memory and know that these variables are going to represent a specific type, because the type can only take so much space. A Boolean, whether it's true or false, it's still the same amount of space. A car or a character is 1 letter, and it can only take so much space. It takes more than a Boolean, but it's never gonna change no matter what letter of the alphabet you pick. A string is an array of characters. And so the only thing that it needs to do, it needs to go and grab like adjacent blocks of memory. But it can go and grab adjacent blocks pretty quickly. The problem with dynamic is that it doesn't know what it's going to be until you actually run the program. And so at the time that it assigns it, right before it assigns the value to the variable, it says, what is this? Oh, it's a Boolean. Let me go and allocate that space for the Boolean. And now it's got to take time before it assigns it. It's got to go take time to allocate that memory space and then assign it. Where if it knew up front, it says, hey, I'm going to need a Boolean. Let me go and allocate that ahead of time. And so by the use of dynamics, you want to make use of them very little, because you're going to hit performance problems. If you make everything dynamic, then you might as well just go use JavaScript. Because JavaScript, that's exactly what happens. It's a late binding language. It doesn't bind the memory allocation until later in the runtime of the program. Where if you predefine the types, it can allocate that before it actually begins to run the program. And it doesn't happen with all of it. It happens with most of it. So that's the dynamic types. It does allow you to store anything, but it comes at a price. It's a very, very heavy price of performance that you would be paying.
All right.
So you can go ahead and do dynamic. Let's do a D variable and then just assign equals 1.
Do I need the quotes?
No, just
Okay.
a value. And so, yeah, so at runtime, it says, oh, this dynamic is an integer. Let me go and allocate that. And it needs to go take the time to do that. And so that's where your performance is going to be, you're going to hit performance at that point. It's not your best practice, but it is there. I don't recommend using it unless you really have to, you know, but yeah, there's ways to get around that. And there's been a few cases where I've had to use it, but use it sparingly. That's my advice. So everything, yeah, let's talk about local variables. So everything that you have here, all these variables that you've declared are only available within that block of code. You cannot access any of these outside of that block of code. So if you try to go to line 20 and start a new line and say B equals false. And if you try to run this, let's see what happens.
We got an error that says the name B does not exist currently.
In the current context.
Yeah.
So they're calling the context the block of code.
Okay, so the whole thing is just doesn't work.
Correct. It can't compile it. It won't run it. So the variable B on line 10 is not available outside of that block of code. You can only access it within that block of code. If you wanted to make it available, so let's go ahead and get rid of line 21. And let's go and add a line after line 6, a new line. Now we need to create a member to the class that all the methods can access. And let's just go ahead and put static string, sorry. And then call it, I don't know, str.
Right here.
Yeah, so you're defining what str is, the variable. Okay. And you're defining it as a static string of the class. And so that str, we just call it Victor with double quotes. And so after line 17, start a new line and do a console write line str. And then after line 23, let's change str. Just type in str equals Jonathan inside of double quotes. And then do a console write line str on the next line. Yeah. And then one last thing, after line 18, let's go ahead and start a new line and let's call the method say hello to the world. And let's run this. So you can see where Victor comes up and then hello world and then Jonathan comes up. Now let's go look at the program itself, right? Go ahead and close the console application or console, the terminal, and go ahead and scroll all the way to the top. Yeah, right there. That's perfect. You'll notice that line 6 and line 29 are considered a block. So you've defined the variable str on line 7, which is inside of that, the class block, right? Which means that whatever you've defined at that level is now available at any block of code below that level. That's called variable scoping. So the scope of that variable, the availability, is specified by the brackets. So anything outside of the class program won't be able to see the variable str. But any inner blocks from the class program will be able to see it.
Okay.
I feel like that just like
Yeah.
blew
Yeah.
your mind. Does it make sense? The
Yeah.
whole scoping of variables?
Hmm.
So it's based on the blocks. You can't access it outside of the blocks, but the inner blocks can access variables that are declared outside of their blocks, as long as they're located inside of another block.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
What's the next topic?
Next topic. Basically just going into nulls. So we're gonna work with some null values.
We could skip that. We're going to be working with nulls left and right.
Okay.
Yeah. No, well, really quickly. What is your experience? You said nulls were what now?
Um, I said nulls are just values that are not assigned yet or just missing at the moment, kind of thing.
Yeah. I normally try to avoid null values, and it's missing, it's not assigned, or someone forgot to assign it. Okay, and you just never know which one of the three. An integer is always going to be an integer no matter what, and it's going to be a numeric value. So there's something there. A character is always going to be a character. A Boolean value is always going to be a Boolean value. A string is always going to be a string, right? It's either going to be nothing there or some type of value in any of those types. But a null value, it has so many different variation. It's a value that hasn't been assigned, or it's a value that, what was the other one?
Is missing or hasn't.
Missing, yeah,
And then,
or hasn't been assigned, right?
yeah, that's it.
And my third favorite one is somebody forgot to assign it, you know. It's like it's just so many variations, you know, that yeah, having to deal with nulls is not a good thing. I would much rather deal with like a 0 than a null int. You know what I mean? It's like, what the heck does that even mean? I'm not saying they're not useful. They're very useful. You know, they have their use. But I would much prefer to say, hey, if this has a 0, then we need to assign a number to it. But what if 0 is a valid number, right? Now you have to think of like, okay, well, if it's a -1, then we know that anything negative, it hasn't been assigned and we need to assign it. We need to do something with it. But then you come into the problem where like, what if negative, 0, and positive numbers are valid? Now what do? It's like you just ran out of options to indicate that something needs to go into this. And so that's where nulls come into play. You know, it's like, okay, if we're going to use null, then we need to make sure that this null is assigned and we're not going to forget it, you know? So yeah, nulls are very debatable topic on how they're being used and in what cases they're being used. They have their place. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put them into C#. But we try to, again, like dynamics, you try to minimize the number of times that you use a null. Okay. And that's one that the necessary evil needs to be there. So yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
I think that's pretty much it. He just kind of goes into a little bit, exploring console applications a little bit more.
Cool. So yeah, so we covered the verbs, the nouns, which are methods for the verbs, and the nouns are the types, the fields, and the variables. We talked about the Camel and Pascal casing, or what he calls title casing. We covered the strings. That was quite a bit there. You taught me about workspaces. Good. You know, like I said, I've never worked with workspaces, so working with Visual Studio 2019, you always work with solutions. So working with Workspaces, I think it'll be a good thing to learn more about and see how they plan to use it more. Yeah, I think this is cool. And then we throw in a little extra bit, the .watch run.
Oh yeah.
That was kind of cool.
Yeah, seeing it actually run in real time.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And we did it in Linux, which is maybe now we'll be cool with the Linux crowd. Maybe they'll finally let us into their community. All right. So as a sidebar or a extra to the podcast, we are going to register a domain and we're going to post the website. And in the next episode, we'll announce the domain name. And we're going to continue on with the podcast, but register the domain, but it'll be an extra. And so we'll have a link to it as we register the domain. We'll go through the whole process. So as a beginner, this should be pretty exciting to watch.
Cool, yeah, I'm excited.